So when I first sat down to write this second book, that was kind of a little bit of the story that I wanted to tell, a story of sisters who were in transition, sisters who were moving from a larger city to a smaller one, sisters who were going through something that was, you know, a difficult time in their family. And I also really wanted to explore some family issues, some family themes. One of the things that I try to tackle in the Wartime Sisters is this idea that we all are kind of born into these set roles in our family. We have these set parts that we're supposed to play. So in the story, we have sisters Millie and Ruth is the older sister. She's more responsible. She is the quote unquote smart one. She is the one who is forced to tackle all the difficult things for her family. If there's a funeral to be planned, she's the one who has to plan it. She's the one who has to do the hard stuff. And Millie is the younger sister. She's very beautiful. She's allowed to be flaky. She's allowed to, you know, be irresponsible because she feels things more deeply for whatever reason. These are the roles that they're told that they are supposed to fit into when they're young. And my thought in writing this book was, you know, how can we ever break free from those roles? And can we ever break free from them? Can the people who have known us the longest ever really see us differently? And do those people who have known us the longest in our lives really know us the best when we grow up to adulthood? So I always say, you know, if you were having Thanksgiving dinner at your grandmother's house when you were like 8 years old and you were fidgeting and you ended up spilling something, the cranberry sauce on your grandmother's white rug, all the people sitting around that table think of you forever after as the klutzy one, or, you know, the wild kid who couldn't sit still. And even if you're 40, 50, 60 years old later on, when you see those people who are around that table, are they going to think of you that way? So those were sort of the themes in my head when I was starting to write this book. And I had this idea, because I was setting it in Springfield, that I was going to have a character who was an older woman who had worked at the Springfield Armory during World War II. When my mother moved to Springfield, it was the early 1960s, and that was the time that I thought this book was going to be written in. But when I went to sort of research the Armory to write this character, because even though it was a small character and even though it was just a backstory, I needed to do a little bit of research. When I went to do that research, I kind of couldn't find my way out of it because it was so fascinating. A little bit of research is a very dangerous thing. And when I went to learn about the women who worked at the Springfield Armory and the sorts of jobs that they had, there was just too much. It was too rich. There were too many stories for me to look away. So if you see this photograph, this is just the kinds of advertisements that were around during World War II. Women were, as we all know, you know, we all have that image of Rosie the Riveter, so I wanted to try to find a different image for all of you. But this ad is saying to get a war job, that longing won't bring, you know, your husband or your son bring, you know, back any sooner. And that was exactly what the women at the Springfield Armory did. When I first went to research it, I was just reading at first, and I came across this photograph. When I was growing up, I grew up in Longmeadow, right next to Springfield. So I grew up probably about 15 minutes away from the Armory. I had thought, just from what I knew, which was very little, that the Armory was one building, that it was just like one factory building, and that they made guns there, and that was it. And yeah, sure, it was important, but you know, I didn't ever think that it looked anything like this. And although this drawing is from 1850, you can see even from this drawing that it was sort of like a campus. So all these buildings around it were part of the Armory complex. So it wasn't just one building as I had originally thought. There were homes for officers there. There were all kinds of buildings. The date on this, 1850, was the first thing that just made me do a double take, because I had no idea that the Armory was that old. So it actually started as an arsenal, which is a storage place for weapons. So after the Revolution, when we borrowed all of these weapons from the French, or we were given all these weapons from the French, we needed a place to store them, and many weapons were stored at the Springfield Arsenal. And then after the war, George Washington decided we were kind of caught unawares and we needed to have more armories, and he actually commissioned the Springfield Armory, which I never knew. I never would have imagined that its history went back so far. So this is just a sort of another advertisement for the Armory. I think it's amazing because I think that the acronym WOW for Women's Ordnance Workers is so fantastic. And when I started with that reading, I saw that photograph, and then I went, of course, you know, when we do research now, we start online and we poke around. And what I found was a website for the Springfield Armory called Forge of Innovation. And when I went to that website, there were actually about 24 recordings of men and women who had lived and worked at the Armory during World War II. The recordings were made in the 1980s. Someone had the great foresight to make them because most of the people are not around anymore. But these were people who had worked there, but also people who had lived there as children of officers or in various other roles. So I started listening to those interviews. And when I listened to them, that was what really absolutely made me understand that I had to write about this place in greater detail than I originally thought. And that was when I decided I was going to move my story back 20 years from the early 60s to the early 40s during World War II. And some of those interviews included a woman who was a single mother at 18 and started working at the Armory, putting together triggers. And she sort of gave me the idea for Millie's job. And because I had thought Millie was going to be maybe a single mother, and, you know, it became a very different kind of single mother, someone who lost her husband in the war. But it was a really interesting idea that here was another single mother talking about what it meant to her, for her to be working when her child was so young. Another one of the interviews was with a commanding officer's wife who worked at the Armory, lived at the Armory in the house that Lillian in my story lives in, who is a commanding officer's wife. And this woman talked about the entertaining that she did there because she had to entertain other officers and their wives, and also different businessmen from the Springfield area and their wives, because those were people who were suppliers for the Armory for all the different materials that they needed. She talked about the greenhouses at the Armory and how she used to go to them and collect flowers and deliver them to the other officers' wives. And she talked about having kind of a music club in her house and playing piano, giving piano lessons to kids, having book clubs in her home. And so all of these things started to give me a very different picture of this place that I thought I knew, which I really didn't know at all. And she became, you know, sort of the building blocks for my character of Lillian, because I thought it would be really important to have someone like that at the Armory. There was an interview with a young woman. It was funny. She had been a teenager. Her father had been an officer there. And she talked about bringing her dates, how she had to drive through the kind of main gate, and the guards would shine their flashlights in her date's face and kind of always try to intimidate whoever she brought home with her. And there was one person who it was one of the interviews of one of the men who lived there. He lived there when he was a little boy, and he talked about a swimming pool and tennis courts. And all of these things made me so confused, because who would imagine a swimming pool or tennis courts at an Armory? And I knew I had to look further, dig deeper, and, you know, I was convinced I was going to write about it, but I just wasn't even sure yet what I was going to find. There were many amazing photographs when I actually went to go poking around and doing research at the actual Armory after I listened to all of those recordings and did some reading. And this is one of the photographs that's my favorite. This is just one of the women who was working there, but there's something about her face that I think is just, I don't know, it just really grabbed me. This is a photograph of a bunch of high school students. So one of the things that I found that was so interesting about the Armory was, as I said, you know, it was this huge place. There were not only buildings for manufacturing, but there were buildings where there were administrative offices. There was a giant payroll office. There were so many buildings, in fact, that they were actually given numbers instead of names. So you would go to building 105, or in my story, you know, Ruth's home is building 5/6. So these girls are high school students from the Springfield area. They were messengers at the Armory, because if you wanted to send a message from one building to another, you would send one of these girls. So they worked after school, and this is just one of the examples of a way in which young women helped out at that time. This is another woman working on the factory floor. These just kind of give you a sense of what it was like there. So when I started reading about all this stuff and hearing about the tennis court and the swimming pool, I knew I wanted to see a map if I could find one. So this is a map of 1939. So it's a few years before my story takes place, but it's a landscape report from Armory Square. And if you can sort of see my cursor, this area was Federal Square, and this is where all of the factory buildings were at that time. So they were across the street. The main gate is here, and this is Armory Square. So this entire area here in the middle is like a park. I mean, it really feels that way, even today if you go there. And today it's a college campus for Springfield Technical Community College, but it feels like that. It feels like more like a campus or a park than anything else. The main Arsenal building was here, but that swimming pool that I was talking about is here, and there were tennis courts here and over here. And along here was officer housing, and here also homes for officers. There was a big ballistics tunnel here and administrative buildings here and here. And so this area is sort of Armory Square on this side of the street was bucolic and more like a country club. There were gardens, and I'm going to show you photos of those. There were greenhouses, there were beautiful homes. And then on this side of the street, you had these buildings, these factories, where guns and weapons of war were being made, because it was, after all, an armory. And so the juxtaposition of those two things, of this beautiful side, this side of, you know, peaceful trees and benches and tennis courts, and then this other side where weapons are being forged, you know, the juxtaposition of those two things was just so intriguing to me, and it made me realize this is such a perfect place to stage a conflict between my two sisters, because they are opposites also, like the two sides of this place. And just even looking at the map, I felt that. And the first time I went to the Armory and I walked around, I really felt it. So this is one of the examples of what I was talking about when I say how beautiful it was. So this is the commanding officer's home at the Armory. It's still there. You can still see it today. I was lucky enough to go inside of it. But this is what I first saw in just some photographs. So this is where my character Lillian lives. And you can see again, you know, there's this fountain here. It doesn't look anything at all like you would think an armory would look like. Here are some of the gardens. Was a rose arbor right back here. I'm just circling it with my cursor. But the hedges, the lights, the shrubbery, the trees, the Works Progress Administration hired tons of gardeners to take care of the Armory grounds. And it was one of the ways that they were able to give jobs to people during the war who couldn't otherwise be fighting. And it was, you know, a wonderful thing. I mean, to be hired to take care of this beautiful and important place. Here are more of the gardens. And again, you can see this sort of rose arbor and what it was like at that time. And this is the back of the commanding officer's house where all this beauty was. I have a scene in my story where Lillian sits down with her husband and they're looking at the roses, and the ballistics tunnel is sort of off in the distance where they're testing out these guns. And again, it's that juxtaposition of beauty and peace and stillness, and then war and noise and kind of a little, you know, preview of the horror that might come out of it. Those were sort of the images that were really captivating me when I was writing this story. So when I knew that I wanted to write about the Armory, and I knew that I wanted my two sisters from Brooklyn who were moving from there to Springfield to be the main characters of this story, I also felt very strongly that I wanted to capture some of the other women who were at the Armory. So Lillian was one of them, this officer's wife. And when I started to think about Lillian and I started to do my research for this book, one of the things that I did was focus on just sort of culturally what was going on at the time. So when you write historical fiction, of course, if you're picking a specific place like the Armory, or you're picking France, you know, during World War II, you have to get everything about your place correct. But you also have to be able to give your readers a feel for what life was like then, what was going on then. So what music were people listening to? What clothes were they wearing? Who were the celebrities of that time? What movies were people watching? So I came across something about Carole Lombard. I'm not sure how many, usually when I was back before COVID, when I was able to do this presentation in person, I would put this slide up on the screen and I would say, who knows who this is? And someone would always say Carole Lombard. So Carole Lombard was a fairly famous movie star. She married Clark Gable. He was not her first husband. He was her second, I believe. And in 1941, when the US got into the war, she decided that she wanted to do whatever she could to help. And so in January of 1942, she went on a war bond drive, and she flew in a plane to her home state, which I think was Indiana. And she raised $2 million for the war effort that night, which is like $34 million today, some enormous number. And very, tragically, on the way home, her plane crashed, and she was 32 years old. So she died, in my mind, when I read about this, I felt that she really died in service to her country. She was, in a certain way, not the same way a soldier is, but in a certain kind of way, she was a casualty of war. Had it not been for the war, had it not been for her desire to serve her country, she would not have perished in that plane crash. And so that kind of character, that that sacrifice, was something I was really looking to show in my character of Lillian. And physically, very much I think of Carole Lombard when I think of Lillian. That was the kind of the look that I was going for, that I wanted her to embody, but also not just the physical part of her, but her character as well. This is a picture of Sophie Tucker, who is a pretty famous vaudeville singer. And Sophie Tucker, it's not that Sophie Tucker was the inspiration for my character of Arietta, but when I was doing my research, I came across a line, which I'm going to read to you. It was a line from a book about the Army and the women that worked there. And it said, if I can find it, women from every strata of society did their bit. A woman college professor worked as a lathe operator. A Gold Star mother was employed as a woodworker. And a well-known opera singer worked as a short-order cook in the Armory cafeteria. And so when I read that line in the course of my research, I knew, you hear that, a short-order cook, an opera singer worked as a short-order cook. I just had this image immediately of a singing cook. And I thought it would be such a great character, because my other characters are sort of deeper, darker, with a lot going on and a lot of history. And Arietta became an opportunity to have a lighter character, someone who could be a very good friend to my character Millie. And so when I thought about having an opera singer, for whatever reason, I decided an ex-vaudeville singer would sort of be more fun and lighter still. And the research that I did into Springfield at that time included just finding out about one of the movie theaters, which was the Loew's Poli. And the Loew's Poli had been, in its day, a vaudeville theater. And Sylvester Poli had been an Italian immigrant who started off his business in New Haven. And he was a pretty prominent vaudeville theater owner of many theaters up and down the East Coast. And I thought it would be great to just sort of incorporate him just very minimally in the story, and to have Arietta's father be one of his builders. And that was how the character of Arietta came to be. So this was me this slide sort of shows you me building my cast of characters. So I have my two sisters from Brooklyn over here, and then my officer's wife Lillian here, and then this singing cook Arietta. And that became my cast of characters. And I was pretty much that far along in thinking about my story when I actually decided I was going to go to the Armory for the first time. So by that point, I was putting together the story, I was putting together the characters, I was thinking about the plot, I had done a lot of research, and then I called Alex McKenzie, who's the curator of the Armory Museum, to make my first visit. I actually went to the Armory 3 times in researching this book. But the first time that I went, I met with Alex, and he was kind enough to show me all around the grounds and walk with me. I think he didn't really know what to make of me when I first got there. I came in and I said, I'm writing a book about this place. And he just, I think at first he thought I was just like, I don't know, just a crazy person, because I was not writing a serious historical book. I was writing a novel, which was really different. He actually, I'll show you some of the photographs. He took me inside what is Lillian's house, the commanding officer's quarters. And we walked the whole house. We walked, up to this turret room, and then he took me down to the basement to where the coal chute was. And he said, this is where you can bury the dead body. And I had to tell him that I wasn't writing that kind of a story, but a very different one. But we had a lot of fun. So when I went to see the Armory for the first time, this is what I drove into, the main gate. And although there are no guards there now, it's still this gate is still there. It still very much looks like this. And you can see that even from when you first walk in, it has this collegiate feel. So this was really important for my opening scene when Millie first sees the Armory. And I was able to sort of walk through the grounds with the curator and think about what my characters might be feeling. This is, again, the commanding officer's house in the wintertime, so you could get a sense of what it might be like at Christmas or another, you know, sort of that festive time of year. This is what it looked inside the commanding officer's house. So when I was inside it, it wasn't furnished like this. It was empty. But even so, as I walked through it, I could get a sense of the parties that would have been thrown here and what kinds of scenes I wanted to have in my story. A party scene in a story is always really good for drama, for bringing characters together, for sort of setting a stage. If you think about them like almost as action figures or little dolls, and you put them all in one little small area, things are going to heat up. And so I was thinking about all of those women's meetings and what people were going to say to each other when they were in this room together. And that was really helpful to be able to actually be in the rooms. This is Ruth's house. So it's interesting because I'm going to show you a later picture that I took of it. So this is what it looks like today. And this is one of the commanding officer's homes. It was actually a two-family house, which cracks me up because my first book was called The Two-Family House. But this is a side-by-side two-family house. So one family, you know, had the left side, one family had the right side. And I was able to go inside it because they were renovating it at the time. And it was so, even one half of this house was enormous. You know, it was more than enough for a family. There was a big parlor kind of in the front with a fireplace, a huge kitchen in the back, 4 bedrooms upstairs. Many of the bedrooms had, at least 2 or 3 of them had fireplaces. And it was just really elegant and really beautiful. And when I stood there looking at the outside of this house, it helped me so much to kind of come up with what Millie would have been feeling. You know, Millie comes from Brooklyn to Springfield. She takes a train with her toddler. She has no husband. She has one battered suitcase. She has like 2 pennies to rub together, if that. And she arrives at this home, which is so elegant, which is so spacious, when she's been living in, you know, a tiny tenement, basically. And she sees that this is where her sister lives. This is her sister's home. Her sister is living in sort of the lap of luxury, and she's never offered to have her come for a visit or to help her in any way. And so that really was something that allowed me to figure out what Millie's emotions were going to look like at that point and just how resentful she might be. This is a photograph that I love because it shows, you know, the women working on the floor of one of the factory buildings. And this is Millie's world. She comes and she lives in this beautiful, elegant house, but she's working here every day. She's on the factory floor, so she's still really in a different world from what Ruth's world is. And this is a photograph of the cafeteria. So this is Arietta's world. This is where Arietta comes every day to be cooking. She would be like one of these women here cooking, and except that, of course, at lunchtime on certain days, Arietta pulls a milk crate into the middle of the room and stands on it and sings for everyone. So music was a really important part of Armory life. And one of the things that was so fascinating about the research was to see how the people who were running the city, running the Armory, tried to keep up morale and tried to keep everyone sort of creating a sense of community for everyone. So lunchtime concerts that they had were part of this. So this is one of the lunchtime concerts. And just as the Works Progress Administration hired all these gardeners to take care of the grounds at the Armory, they also hired all these musicians to play concerts at lunchtime. So this is just like a typical, this is not a special occasion, this is just a typical lunchtime concert that was being given. So when I think about Arietta coming and singing, I feel like she, you know, some of these musicians might have gone to the cafeteria and played for her, and this is sort of what was going on at the Armory. The reason that I know about all these different things, these lunchtime concerts and stuff, are because of this booklet that you see here, not just this one, but a series of them. So when I went to the Armory the first and second time, I went through all of these issues of this booklet called the Armory News. You can't tell from this picture, but the Armory News was almost like the size of a playbill. Like if you went to a show these days and you got a playbill, it was about 30 pages, and it was chock full of just articles and gossip pages, sports pages, photographs, spotlight pieces about people who worked at the Armory, a few serious letters, maybe from generals and other people who were, you know, giving war updates on battles and things, that to the extent that they could, cartoons, all kinds of things. And the people who were working at the Armory put this out once a month for about 2.5 years. And it was a really amazing resource for me to figure out what daily life was like at the Armory. So there were pieces like this one, how women should dress, how men should dress too, but this is one for women. You know, don't wear your rings, make sure you wear comfortable shoes, make sure your hair is covered, because we don't want to have any accidents. There were cartoons like this one, which are so amazing. How can you help win the war? And, you know, just all kinds of advice about what people should do. And there are photographs of just like a group of people. The day that the Armory news comes out, everyone's just sort of sitting around and looking at it. It was kind of like almost like a high school newspaper in a way, you know, that was run and written by the people who were working there, and they all sort of had a personal stake in it. This is a poem that was on one of the pages that I really love. And if you read it through, you'll see, you know, it says, for want of a worker, the gun was lost. For want of a gun, the tank was lost. For want of a tank, the position was lost, on and on, until, you know, for want of a war, the country was lost, and all because of an absentee. So pieces like this were one of the ways that the people at the Armory were trying to instill this sense of responsibility in the people who were working there. Because if you missed a day of work and the war was lost, you know, it was potentially your fault because you weren't there when your country needed you. There were pieces like this about spies. Loose talk can cost lives. Spies can be anywhere. This was a very real concern for people at that time. You know, defense plants were a prime target for spies, for explosions, you know, for someone to come along and try to disrupt production. And so that became one of the subplots of my story, actually. There was a fire at the Springfield Armory, but it happened during a different time. Than I sort of switched the time. I took some liberties with the timing in my book because I wanted it to happen when all of my characters were there, but after Millie had already arrived. And, you know, people were, she's one of the suspects for a little bit. Some people are trying to pin it on her and on Arietta because of Arietta's Italian heritage. And this is the sort of thing, you know, that people really were afraid of people disrupting production in this way. This is a picture of the Springfield Armory Rifle Club. And so the Rifle Club was one of many, many clubs. And there were all kinds of photographs like this in those booklets. So there was a baseball team that the Armory had. There was a football team. There was a bowling team. There were basketball teams. And there were pages and pages of sports results. You know, they would play other defense plants. They would play local college teams. It was just really fascinating that the Armory had all of this for the people who worked there. There was also a lot of sexism. I mean, that was something that was a very real thing at the time. If you read through this little piece on the left, it talks about the Army Navy E award that the Armory received, that everyone received. And so everyone got pins as, you know, instead of like a trophy, you got this special pin that said that you were part of the group of people working at the Armory when this award was given for production. And this talks about a captain going through and presenting pins to the young women who work there, and how, you know, he asked for a kiss, and by the time he finished going down the line, he was blushing because his face was covered with lipstick marks from every shade. And then they say, "Nice going, Captain," because of course that was how they thought about things back then. And there was a Miss Springfield Armory contest. So there were these sorts of things going on. It was something that the women who worked at the Armory had to deal with and had to face every day. So I think, you know, there's a little bit of that in my story. I think it would be not realistic if I didn't include it. There was a wonderful dance at the Armory. There were many dances, but there was one that I include in the story, and I put a whole scene of it in the story. And it just, what I found so fascinating about Springfield during that time was the way the city accommodated the people who lived and worked at the Armory. So this dance was one of the examples. The dance started like at 7 or 8 at night, and it went until 3 or 4 in the morning. And that was because the Armory was running 24 hours a day. There was a shift that went from, I think, 3 in the afternoon until 11 at night. So if you were on that shift, you couldn't go to a dance if it ended early. And so that's why the dance stayed so late. So if you got off at the 11 o'clock shift, you could go and put on a dress or put on a suit and head over to the dance and keep it going until 3 in the morning. And similarly, if you started in the 11 o'clock shift, you could go to the dance early. You could go at 7 or 8 o'clock, and you could have time to dance and have a good time before you had to be at work. And, you know, this was the case with not just dances, but if you were on the shift, the 11 p.m. shift that ended at 7 in the morning, there were movie theaters in Springfield at that time that were showing movies at 8 o'clock in the morning. Because if you got off work at 7 a.m., it was morning, but for you, it was, you know, your nighttime. It was your time to do something fun. So the city worked around the people who were working at the Armory. At the height of production in 1942 and 43, there were 12,000 people working there. And of that number, about over 40% were women. So, you know, the city just accommodated them. And I think that's just an amazing thing. These are just some more great photographs of that dance, and it took place in the Springfield Armory. One of the things about research that's kind of funny is sometimes you go down these just these rabbit holes. So I knew all about this dance. I had seen photographs of the dance, not this one here, because this one would have given me a real clue as to where it was held. But for the longest time, I was trying to figure out where the dance was. There were articles about it in the Armory newsletter, but it never said where it was. So it was held at the Springfield Auditorium, and I only found that out because I was able to find an article in the Springfield Republican newspaper that advertised it. But other than that, there was nothing in the stuff that was written about it that said where it was. It was just in that ad to buy tickets. One of the really exciting events that happened at the Armory was something that I included in the very last scene of the book. And that was Benny Goodman's visit to the Armory in 1943. So at that time, there was a radio show called the Victory Parade of Spotlight Bands. And this show was really neat. It used to travel all around the country to defense plants and to Army bases. And they would bring really famous musicians and bands to these places and do a radio show, live record it at the place for morale. You can actually listen to this concert on, there's like an old time radio website, and I've listened to it. So it sort of, they do this whole roll call, and they say the men and women of the Springfield Armory, and there's a huge, you can hear, there were 5,000 people at this concert, so you can hear the cheer that goes up from the crowd and hear everyone screaming for Benny Goodman. And they actually do like a sort of reenactment of this kind of thing every year at the Armory, or they did. I'm sure they aren't doing it this summer, but they have like a big band concert and swing dancing that they do at the Armory to reenact this kind of thing. But I thought this was, it's something that the people who know about it are still really proud of, that he came to Springfield. And I wanted to include it in my story. It was when you come across something like this, where I knew there were 5,000 people and I could hear that crowd. I knew it was kind of a really great time to set maybe something more sinister. And I won't give so much away about the book, but something happens during this concert that, you know, it's sort of more of a thrillery type kind of scene, because you just know that people won't hear things that are going on inside someone's house if there's a crowd of 5,000 people outside their door. And it was kind of strange to me. I was trying to find out more about the security. Only people who worked at the Armory and their personal, they each got one guest to come to this concert could go, because it was on the Armory grounds, but also people's homes were on the Armory grounds. So that seemed like a little bit of a security problem to me. But that was kind of a funny thing. This is just another photograph of Benny Goodman at that concert. But that sort of shows you that is sort of the journey that I went on, doing all of this research and trying to put this book together. And that is sort of how it went for me from beginning to end, and how the research really helped me, you know, not just with the setting, not just with describing the setting, but even with my characters, describing their feelings. And I really hope, it's, you know, my hope that when you read this story, it makes you think about that issue that I spoke about in the beginning, these family roles and kind of what we are to our family, and will our family be accommodating of us, and to think about what sisterhood means, but also to think about what sisterhood means, not just between members of a family and two sisters who are related to each other, but also this greater sisterhood of women who lived and worked at the Springfield Armory, and the sacrifices that they made and the hard work that they put in. They were all, when I listened to the interviews of them, they were all so proud of the contributions that they had made. for many of them, it was their first job. For many of them, it was the only job they ever had. And I think, you know, it was a difficult thing for so many of them when they were asked to leave, when the war was over and they were let go and they weren't needed anymore. And so I'm just glad that I got to learn more about them and to kind of share all of them with all of you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and then I guess you'll just see my face. Here I am. And so if you guys have questions, I think this would be a great time, and I'm happy to answer anything at all. I think there's a chat, and Debbie, do you want to read them? I can see the questions too, so if you want me to do it, I can do it, or you can read them.
I'll read them out.
Okay, perfect.
So from Sarah, has 2 questions. One is, she says the photos are amazing. Where is your current book, the book you're now working on? Where is that set?
So I just, that's a hard question because I finished a 3rd book, but I'm working on a 4th book now. I'm going to talk about the 4th book because I'm not sure what's happening with the 3rd book. The 4th book is actually, it's set in Springfield also, which is kind of a funny thing. It's more of a family story. It's a little bit more like the 2 family house. It's not as, you know, it's historical fiction still, but it's not set at a real historical location. So it's historical fiction in a lighter sense, not in that heavier sense, but it's set in Springfield and Longmeadow. A lot of the haunts that, you know, the places that I used to go to when I was little, including this place that I think now is called the Pioneer Valley Yacht Club. We used to just call it the Yacht Club. And when you call it the Yacht Club, it's kind of funny because it's the least fancy place that you could ever imagine. I don't know what it's like now, but you used to have to drive through a cornfield to get it. It was on the Connecticut River. And although it was called the Yacht Club, I never once set foot in a boat ever when I was there. It just had a swimming pool. It was like a swim club, basically. So a lot of the story is set there, and it follows the family, and it'll be a fun story, I think. I think people who were really into the 2 family house will really like it.
Okay, and Sarah's second question is, why did you choose historical fiction as a genre?
You know, that's a funny question. I didn't really choose it. When I wrote The 2 Family House, that was just the book that I needed to write. That was my first book. It had been in my head for like 15 or 16 years, and I wanted to write that story. And it so happened that that story was set in post-war Brooklyn, and so it was categorized as historical fiction. But that was kind of news to me because I wasn't really thinking about it that way. I was thinking about it just more as a family saga. With the Wartime Sisters, of course, I knew it was very conscious. This is historical fiction. I think for me, I like to write about the past just because it seems easier to me. It's very difficult for me to think about writing something in present day and having to deal with all the technology, and I feel like I'd constantly be writing, and then my character, you know, looked at her phone and then her cell phone beeped and she got a text, and I feel like I couldn't write that way, and I would be thinking about people that way, and it's easier for me somehow to write about them. It feels richer. I feel like I can do more with the characters when I write about them in the past. So that's the answer to that question.
So I'm just going to come in here with my own question.
Okay. There's one private question that I got from Ellen Murphy, which I think there's a couple. So is it okay if I just read that one? So Ellen asks, is there a danger of getting lost in all the historical details? And so, yeah, there definitely is. Like I said, you know, I went down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out where that dance took place. And that was kind of necessary for the story. I really wanted to be able to describe it, but there were lots and lots of other details that I would get stuck on and that really had no significance. So there was a point, and I still laugh about this with Alex McKenzie, the curator, the museum curator, and we did a presentation together and we talked about this. I was really obsessed with how the people who lived at the Armory got their mail, because there were no mailboxes then. And I didn't know if it was addressed to the Armory, you know, how, like, where did you write to them at? What was the address that you put down? And we could never figure it out. And of course, I didn't really need to know that because I didn't have to, in my story, you know, follow a letter from place to place to place until it, you know, every place the letter got to before it got to the person who was receiving it. But those are the sorts of things that you can really get stuck on, and you have to kind of stop yourself and just keep going forward. So I eventually, you know, after hours and hours and emails and stuff, I had to just say, you know what, it doesn't really matter. I can just say, Millie got a letter, and I don't have to say anything more than that. So.
You know what, I'll save my questions if we have time at the end, because we're getting other questions.
Okay.
So Ellen Murphy asked another question. I think you may have already, how do you balance the amount of historical detail with storyline? I think that's.
Yeah, that's a little different.
Okay.
Balancing, yeah, that is a tough thing when you have historical details and you want to follow them, and then you have your own plot line. And so, you know, the big things I had to stick to, of course, the war, you know, there are things that you have to stick to. There was, like I said, there was a fire at the Armory. I changed when it happened by a few months. I changed the date of the Benny Goodman concert by a few months because I wanted to play with the pacing of the story. I didn't want the story to drag on for so many months and so many years. And so there were certain events that took place at the Armory, and I kind of condensed when they happened so they would all fit into my story when I wanted them to happen. But there is a danger in that, and sometimes people get angry. And so what I did, you know, I wrote an author's note at the back of the book explaining why I did those things. Just because you want people to know that you know when it actually happened. You don't want them to think that you're just getting things wrong. So there is always, I'm always cognizant of that. I'm always trying to balance what actually happened with the plot line. But you have to make sure the story moves. You know, if you can't write a story where nothing happens for 12 years, it just doesn't end up working. So you have to just take some liberties.
And I must say the book, which I thought was just terrific, I found what you wrote at the end really interesting. You had,
I'm glad.
you know, you had some of this information you're talking about now at the end, and you know, I thought that made it a richer experience. Okay, Lindsay is asking, when did the Armory stop functioning in that capacity? Was it used for anything else before it became a technical college?
It was closed. It was shut down sometime in the 1960s. And it was a really sad day for the city of Springfield because, you know, it had been around for a long time. So it did, I don't remember the exact date, but it was in the 1960s. And it was a big, big deal for the city at that time. And I don't think it was used for anything else, really. I mean, the Armory Square part, the sort of park-like area, is Springfield Technical Community College. The other side is manufacturing still. It's just different businesses and stuff. So that side just was bought individual, different buildings were bought by different individual businesses.
Okay, Susan is asking, I learned after my mother passed away that she had spent the summer manufacturing guns in Springfield during the war. Do you know if the Armory has a list of the people who worked there?
You know, I don't know if they have a list. They might, but you could definitely send them an email. You could email Alex McKenzie and he would be able to let you know, because he, as I've said, he's the curator of their museum there. I'm not sure if they're open now because I'm not sure what happened with them during COVID-19. I'm sure they were closed for a while. They may be open now, or maybe just the offices are open. But I'm sure that you could email him and ask him that question, because he's really good about, helping out people who want to learn about the Armory. So, and if you want to, if you can't find his email, it should be online, but if you can't find it, you can email me. And my email is just my full name. So Lynda Cohen Loigman @gmail.com. If you email me, then I can give you his email. So if that's helpful.
Yeah, you're getting some nice feedback. People enjoying it. People are going to go out and get the book.
Thank you.
So we have a few more minutes. If anyone has any more questions, please enter them into chat. Here's something from Judy. When were the last weapons manufactured there?
I'm not sure, because I really focused my research on the World War II era. So I'm not sure, I mean, I think up until they closed, they must have been still doing that, still making weapons. I'm not sure what they were still making. I mean, they made, during World War II, they made M1 rifles, but they were making some other things too, but the M1 rifles were the primary thing that they were making. I'm not sure what they were making after that. Sorry about that, but just wasn't something that was on my list of things to know.
So one of my questions is, I know you did a lot of research about Springfield, but a good part of the book took place in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. So did you have to research Brooklyn?
You know, I researched Brooklyn for the two-family house because even though, first of all, I had, for a lot of my life, I had my grandmother as a research consultant, although she passed away before the book ever came out. And my mom's two sisters are both still alive, and they tell me things. So I kind of get personal experiences and flavor from them, but there were definitely things that I had to research about Brooklyn for the two-family house. And I sort of used that research for the Wartime Sisters. I didn't really need to go back and research too many other things because the scenes, the Brooklyn scenes in the Wartime Sisters are generally kind of contained, you know, like they're in the family's home. They're not really like kind of out and about all over Brooklyn the same way. So there were definitely, I always seem to have like a baseball scene and I have to research stuff about that. But I did do some research. I did some research. Well, you and I, Debbie, were talking a little bit before we started the program about gangsters, you know, gangsters, post-war gangsters. And so I did a little bit of research about that just because for the two-family house, because there was a character, but also for the Wartime Sisters, there's not post-war, but pre-war. One of the characters, Millie's husband, is sort of, you know, a ne'er-do-well kind of guy, and so is his brother. And so I did read a lot about gangsters in New York City at that time. So there's a lot of reading that I do that I don't really know if I guess it's research, but it's sort of to get an overall flavor, to spark ideas. So there was a lot of gangster reading. Was reading, I was just trying to sort of figure out what the schools looked like, because there's a scene outside of a school, just kind of making sure things are right. So it's not like the Armory research where I just had to learn all about this place and sort of learn all the different stories and all the different things that happened, because then I could fashion them into a story. It's more like a specific thing. So I think, oh, I want them to go to have a scene at a soda counter. So now I'm going to research what soda counters look like there. It's more specific and sort of more targeted, just toward one scene. So that was how the Brooklyn research was for this book.
Okay, so we have only a few minutes and we have 3 questions, so maybe answer them quickly. How long did the book take to write, research included?
So this book took about 2 years with the research and everything and all the writing, maybe a little bit more, but about 2 years from start to finish. So I had written a bunch, you know, as I was researching. Then I went to the Armory. Then I had to fill in and redo and keep researching and keep writing.
Okay. Molly is asking, did you know the ending of the story first, or did you develop it along the way?
I tend to know, so both. I know a general outline of my stories when I'm thinking of them. I can't really write a story unless I have a story, and a story means I have a beginning and a middle and an end in my head. I'm not kind of one of the people who just thinks of a character and then just starts writing and seeing where the character takes me. I like to know what the real guts of the story is. But the way that I get there in between the beginning, middle, and the end, I don't know entirely. So I just kind of move along that way. So it's a little bit of both. I know the ending, but I also develop a lot of things as I'm writing.
Okay, and we're going to end on this question, which is from Susan. What part of Brooklyn did your family come from?
Yes. So my mom grew up in Brownsville, and actually there's someone who sent me a message after. This is so sweet. There's a message. I can just see the chat. So my mom grew up in Brownsville. It always makes me laugh because the cover of the two-family house is this beautiful brownstone. And my mom did not grow up in a beautiful brownstone at all. It was not a pretty building, but that's where she came from. And someone named Marilyn Silverstein messaged me to say that she was a schoolmate of my mom, which is so nice, at Thomas Jefferson High School in Brooklyn. So yeah, that's where my mom went to high school in Brooklyn. I still have her high school yearbook, Marilyn, so that's amazing. And she says that she visited my grandparents' home in Springfield, Mass. This is going to make me cry. This is so sweet. Thank you, Marilyn. That's so sweet. So that's where they were from. But that's a very sweet message and just made my day. So thank you.
And actually, both my parents went to Thomas Jefferson High School also.
Oh, wow. It's
So,
a funny thing.
yeah.
In Brooklyn, it seems like people ask you what high school you went to. That's like,
Yeah.
that tells you where you lived,
Right.
depending on the high school. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lynda. This was just a great
Thanks all
talk.
of you.
And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining
I love
us.
talking to all of you. And I think, this, like things like this, these Zoom things for everyone, it's a way to stay connected and to just kind of get through this time. And I hope for everyone that you're all healthy and you're safe and just keeping your mind active as we can. And thank you so much for having me. I really, I'm very appreciative.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who joined us.
Right. Thank you so
Stay
much.
safe. Bye.